As I've mentioned a number of times on this channel, I'm a huge fan of non-English speaking genre movies, specifically stuff like monster films, B-movies, horror films, but not ones which are just non-English for the sake of it or just for the gimmick of it not being English and reading subtitles, but ones which are genuinely good, and at least as good, if not better, more often than not, than a lot, I would say probably 90% of Western horror. Or maybe even 90% of horror from the countries that they come from. You do occasionally get non-English horror movies which do bleed over into Western culture. They generally get, well, okay remakes sometimes subpar ones. You've got movies like The Ring or The Grudge, which are pretty well known, but then you've got others which haven't had remakes yet, and I personally hope that they don't, such as Train to Busan, which I discussed here on the channel. It's getting more and more of a good reputation, even through Western, not necessarily cinema screenings, but streaming services, for instance. People are starting to know more about movies like that, and even one of my absolute favourite movies is not an English-speaking film. Oldboy, the original. I love that film. It's one of the highest rated films I've ever discussed on this channel. So I'm a huge fan of these non-English, what Western countries would call foreign films, which is so pretentious to call them that, but there you go. Now this is another one of my absolute favourites in the non-English genre field, Troll Hunter. This is a movie which I had recommended years and years ago, not specifically to me, but from, I think it was a YouTuber or some movie review channel, I can't recall which, but this movie is set in the north of Europe, and, of course, it's not English speaking, so you've got subtitles. Many people have issues with that. Personally, I don't. As I've said before on the channel, I often use subtitles even on English films, because you miss so much. Things which are said, for instance, when people mumble, which is such a popular thing in cinema these days, or when people say things in background conversations, or on the other end of a phone line, which they include in the subtitles, but if you're just listening to the film, it's easy to miss. I like that. It's an advantage. That's the way I see it. Now, this movie has a very simple plot, and it is in the kind of controversial, but it's doing a bit better, I think, lately, found footage genre. This is specifically about a small group of young people who, if memory serves, because I haven't seen this movie in a while, but if memory serves, I believe they went out to record some bear killings. And these killings wind up being kind of attributed to this one particular guy, who actually may not be what he seems. So they start to try and follow this guy in their found footage way, which is actually very well done, because the handheld footage in this film is great. It's not grainy, it's not cheap, it looks good. It just happens to be handheld instead of a steady shot, but at the same time it's not shaky cam most of the time, which is really refreshing to see, as much as I love Cloverfield. But in this movie, the found footage style is used to great advantage. It's so well justified, because more often than not you'll see found footage used much more as a gimmick. Even something like Cloverfield you could genuinely say is a gimmick. It's basically Godzilla with a handheld camera, in essence. Then you have others which really do justify it, and I would say that this one does, because you would not have a regular cinematic look in a film like this. It just doesn't need that. Because of the nature of the story, it needs to feel smaller, more personal, and just have a smaller group of people with one camera. That's exactly what it does, that's what it needed to do, and it pulls it off really well. Now, this movie does have creatures. Of course, it's called Troll Hunter. Some different types of creatures, and that's as far as I'll go with that. And a lot of it is done with CGI. Now, the creature designs aren't necessarily designs which are the most scary to look at. Definitely not, in fact. But at the same time, the CGI is actually done pretty well, I would say. A lot better than, again, 90% of other horror films. In fact, 90% of horror films that use CGI, I think, have horrendous CGI, whether they're Western films or wherever. So, again, it's very refreshing to see it used so well here, because there are certain films which do justify it. There are certain movies which justify stop motion. There are others which justify practical effects. There are others which justify CGI, genuinely so. This justifies it because, without spoiling anything, there are certain scenes which could not really have been done with practical effects, not just in terms of budget, but just could not have been done. And I can't really explain why unless you've seen the film. If you've seen the film, you'll probably know what scenes I'm referring to. One in particular, well, you couldn't have exactly done that with a model. Let's just put it that way. But overall, I like the characters in this particular movie. You don't get a huge amount of backstory, but with one in particular there's a lot of implied backstory, and he's a very endearing character. It's actually the guy who the kids try to record. This particular guy is easily the most interesting and the best character, I would say, in the movie. Now, the others aren't bad. They're actually all really good, but he's even better than the rest as far as I'm concerned. He's not over the top, he's not ridiculous, he's not loud, he's not even funny or anything like that. He's just a good character. And if there's one word which I could say to sum up his entire performance and his entire character, he's believable. And that also goes for the film in general. Although you could technically say that this is, in effect, the B-movie, it's not at the same time. The quality and the production value and the effort, and again the believability put into the film, not just from a visual point of view, but also from the characters. You can very easily watch a horror movie or a creature feature or a genre film, and people are just there for the paycheck, basically. They are almost smirking at the camera half the time, especially in lower budget ones. That's not the case here. These people look like they believe that what they're doing and the movie that they're in is real. Very Blair Witch style. However, I would say better than Blair Witch. But of course, that's personal. Now, as far as individual scores go on this film, I am going to rate it pretty high. It's not ridiculously high, but in some ways it is quite high. Now, first of all, we have the story and the plot. Now, this is definitely above par, as far as I'm concerned. The story isn't ridiculously in-depth or overly complex or amazingly clever. So, as I've said before with a number of others, it would not be fair to give it a super high score in that way, because even though it's very well carried out, it's still simple. So I am going to give it a 6 out of 10, which is above par, but at the same time, respects other movies which are more complex. As far as the characters, the actors, the casting, choices that the characters make, the believability, as I mentioned earlier, well, that's an easy 7. Now, I feel inclined to actually give this one an 8. I'm going to stick to a 7, because, again, I don't think it would be fair to some other films to bump it up to an 8, but I personally feel that they are worthy of that. But that's from my personal point of view, whereas for this I'm trying to be more academic about it, as I always am, and from that point of view I am still going to give it a 7, because they are very believable. They're not well-known faces in Western countries at least, so that just adds to the believability, but although they're not well-known, their acting is more than good enough all the way through the film, from all of them, which, let's take a moment to appreciate that. There's no weak character in this film, that it really adds to the believability to make it on par with movies like Cloverfield, Blair Witch, Wreck. It's that level of good, if not better, I would potentially say. As far as the visual quality, the special effects, as I said earlier, the CGI, the overall look of the film, of course, when it comes to found footage style or handheld stuff, the quality of the camera work is very important, because anyone can shake a camera. That doesn't make it worth watching. I'm going to give it an 8, and to be honest, it's a very easy 8 for this film, because although some of the CGI, it's not bad, but more so the character design actually than the CGI could have been a little bit more scary or intimidating. Some of it does err more on the side of not humorous, because I don't want to give the impression that this is a silly film. It's not in any way, but some of the creature designs could have been a little bit more intense, let's put it that way. Because if these creatures were real, they would be scary to come across. But at the same time, they don't necessarily look as scary as they act, if you know what I mean. I guess that's kind of the same issue that something like Critters would have, but this is a way better movie than any of those films. As far as the sound goes, the soundtrack, the audio design, well, perhaps, strangely, to some people, I'm actually going to give it another 8. Because sometimes, as I've said before, a lack of music can be just as effective, and in a movie like this, where it's handheld, found footage, almost mockumentary style, you need to buy into the realism of the moment. And sometimes that can be as simple as just a quiet moment with no music, no characters talking, just in a dark part of a forest, listening for footsteps and heavy, creepy breathing. This movie does that really well. It knows exactly how to do that, it knows how to milk the moment audio-wise, and I've got to respect it for that. It's excellent in that regard as far as I'm concerned. And finally, for, of course, the most subjective to me, the rewatchability factor, the entertainment factor, I'm going to give it a 7. Not quite as high as I might initially say off the top of my head, but when I really think about it, I think a 7 is fair for this one, because I have a lot of love for this film, but at the same time, not down to any fault of the film itself, but I think that for some people, they might think that this is just okay. It's that kind of movie. Some people will absolutely love it, myself included, could even be one of their favourites, but for other people, I think they could have the exact same experience, but it just won't necessarily click with them in the same way. And I don't say that for any particular reason. As far as I'm concerned, everything about this film is excellent. The characters, the creatures, the story, the visuals, the audio, everything is well above par. But that's not necessarily a guarantee that people will love it. And you guys, of course, know what I mean, because there are films that you love that your friends probably don't, or movies that they love that you probably don't. That's just the way it is sometimes. People just don't see eye to eye, and they don't necessarily hate the movie, they just don't feel the same way about it. And that could definitely apply to a film like this in particular, because for those who appreciate it for how good it is, you'll probably adore it. I certainly do. But for other people, they'll probably watch it and think, yeah, that was pretty good, but won't necessarily need to watch it again, and won't find it overly memorable. But overall, I am giving this a pretty high score of a cumulative, for the 5 categories put together, 3.6 out of 5, which isn't super high. That's not like The Thing level, or Alien, or Predator even, but it's pretty high. That is certainly up there with a lot of my favourite horror films. So if you haven't seen Troll Hunter, look past the slightly silly name to appreciate what is, I would say, undoubtedly one of the best found footage horror films ever made. So that's it overall for this particular pick. Of course, I'll see you guys next time, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.